Out of the three NVIDIA GPUs that I've taken a look at so far, this one is the least offensive. I mean, I've come to expect not massive gains for this generation of NVIDIA GPUs, but this one is looking like the one to keep your eye on, at least in the current lineup. We get a 17% bump in shader count versus the 4070 Ti. We get more VRAM as well, now up to 16 gigs, and that's running at a much higher bandwidth as well. All this for only a 15 watt increase in claimed TDP, and supposedly it's actually a bit cheaper. As for the generational performance uplift over the 4070 Ti, I found it to be about 19% on average at 1440p. As much as 30% in Horizon Zero Dawn and ACC, or as little as 6 to 8% in Hellblade 2 or Starfield. But to be fair, those two games did show lower GPU usage for the 5070 Ti, so maybe it's a driver bug that will be fixed or something. The median uplift was 23% in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, which is about where most games sit. And if we're going off of MSRP, about a 20% performance uplift for a slightly cheaper card, that's not too bad at all. The power draw also hasn't increased that much either. The listed TDP of the 5070 Ti is 300 watts, but as we've seen with NVIDIA lately, the power draw is highly variable depending on how much you're loading it up. On average, 239 watts, but topping out at 279 in God of War. I also don't have a 4070 Ti Super to compare this card to, but if I did compare it to that card, we'd likely see that 20% average performance uplift brought down to about 12-13%, which also means that in some of those games, you're going to see like only a single-digit percentage point uplift over a 4070 Ti Super. So yeah, if you're shopping for a 5070 Ti, definitely also consider used 40 series GPUs like the 4070 Ti and 4070 Ti Super. And my recommendation for the 5080 is exactly the same. Definitely consider a used 4080 Super. The performance difference is really not that much, and neither is the power efficiency. One GPU which I do think is a pretty interesting comparison though is versus the 3080. This was a very popular high-end GPU, which actually has a very close MSRP as well. If you are looking to upgrade from a 3080, you can expect about a 55% performance uplift. Black Myth Wukong saw almost double the performance, and Cyberpunk isn't too bad either, going from 60 FPS up to 108. This is while pulling a little bit less power draw than the 3080 as well. You'll go from roughly 320 watts to about 250. I did also test the 3070. I figured this was a pretty popular card as well. I know they're priced very, very differently, but you know, if you are a 3070 owner and you do have a bit more cash this time around, it is one hell of an upgrade. You're looking at double the performance on average. Huge uplifts in some of these games. Now, when I've got this GPU on the test bench, I'm assuming two things. One, it's the price that NVIDIA says that it's going to be, and two, people will actually be able to buy it. But those two things have been false, mostly for the 5080 and the 5090. So guessing what's going to happen with this 5070 Ti as well, I mean, it's kind of like looking into a crystal ball. Maybe things will be different, but educated guess, I'd say for the first few months at least, this thing is going to be extremely hard to find, especially online, and the pricing is going to be therefore elevated as well. Now, I did also run some tests at 4K to compare to the 5080 and the 5090, and I was actually pretty surprised with how close the 5070 Ti was to the 5080. There's only like 15% between them, which I guess makes sense because there's only a 20% difference in the shader count, and the memory spec is even closer. So yeah, between these three, 5070 Ti is actually looking decent, and at the very least, it's a capable 4K gaming card for most games. This card also does have DLSS 4 multi-frame gen, which we looked at a little bit more extensively in the 5090 review, but it is available here too. In single-player games that have it supported, and with an input frame rate of at least 60 FPS, I do think that the pros do outweigh the cons when turning on this feature. The frame rate increase is just massive. I think we can all agree how NVIDIA has marketed multi-frame gen has been absolutely terrible, especially when it comes to mainstream consumers of GPUs. They see the graphs, they see the big numbers, and they think that that's the real performance. That is just absolutely not okay. But I mean, when we get down to it and we test out this technology and you use it in games, personally, I am not too much of a hater of it, and it's actually something I can see myself using in some particular games. Now, there's no Founders Edition for the 5070 Ti, which I think is interesting. They didn't do it for the 4070 Ti either. It's a bit of a shame because the 50 series Founders Edition card is an extremely well-built cooler, extremely high quality, very premium, and also very compact. It also means that MSRP pricing doesn't really exist, does it? It's all up to MSI, Asus, Gigabyte, the board partners. The pricing of the 5070 Ti is completely up to them. But anyway, I got sent over the Ventus, which is a nice neutral aesthetic, triple fan cooler, relatively compact as well at only 2.2 slots, and the temperatures and the cooling for this one were absolutely fine. I saw low 60s on an open bench with a 21 degree room temp. Memory junction temp was also about where you would expect. A lot of the cards on the market are going to be a lot more beefy than this one, so temps and fan speeds will be even more impressive. But this one should be a lot closer to the MSRP, and the cooling, as you can see, is perfectly fine. Now, if you're looking at this and you're thinking of maybe waiting for the 5070, maybe the performance is quite close. I don't know what the real world pricing is going to be, as does anyone at this point, but I can tell you the spec difference between these two GPUs is actually massive. It's a lot more than you'd expect for just adding TI on the end of the name. The difference in shader count is absolutely monstrous. There's 4 gigabytes of VRAM between them, and there's also a pretty big difference in the bandwidth as well. So yeah, 5070 Ti is looking like it might be 50% faster for a 36% higher MSRP. That would be pretty crazy. So yeah, the 5070, I'm not expecting much from at all. Then you've got the 5080, which is barely an upgrade over the 4080 Super, and at least based off of the MSRP, is a lot more expensive compared to this. And then there's the 5090, which is just in a completely different realm. That leaves the 5070 Ti actually looking like not the worst GPU, at least among those four. If you can find one at a decent price and it makes sense for your setup as an upgrade, I can recommend it. If you're not in too much of a rush though, maybe wait and see what AMD has to offer with the 9070 and 9070 XT. I think if there's ever been a time recently where AMD has just like peak opportunity to step in and truly impress everyone and kind of steal some of those NVIDIA upgraders, then it's right now.